Our December concert upcoming celebrates the 50th anniversary of the death of one of the greatest composers of our times, Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky is very important to me for personal reasons as well, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about that. I was very, very lucky to be living and growing up and working as a young professional in Los Angeles during the years that Stravinsky was living in Los Angeles. There was even a kind of a funny coincidence that he lived on a street called Weatherly Drive, which was, if you know Los Angeles, it was in the Hollywood Hills above Sunset Boulevard. My parents lived in a very small Beverly Hills house that I used to lovingly refer to as in the slums of Beverly Hills, on Weatherly Drive, very far from where he lived, but actually really the same street and on flat land. The concert series that we are enjoying right now, we call First Monday at Jordan Hall. But there was a series in Los Angeles called Monday Evening Concerts. And when I started the series in 1985, it crossed my mind that a good night to have concerts was Monday because the Boston Symphony was dark, because our orchestras at the conservatory were not playing until later in the week because Monday was after a weekend when they couldn't rehearse. And so I hit on the idea of having a concert on a recognizable time, the first Monday. But in my mind, there was some relationship with those days in Los Angeles. It was a little bit for me the feeling of how would it have been if I were living in Vienna in the 1820s. And I knew that in the same city, I, as a young musician, was studying and working. In that same city, Beethoven was living. I had kind of a feeling about the fact that I was in Los Angeles and Stravinsky was in Los Angeles. And what was especially meaningful to me was that in very certain ways, I crossed paths with Stravinsky. The Monday evening concerts often played pieces of his of small instrumentation that were either premieres or revivals, because the director of the Monday evening concerts, Lawrence Morton, had become very friendly with all the composers in Los Angeles, including Stravinsky. And Stravinsky relished that relationship, and so he was very friendly with the Monday evening concerts. So I encountered him there. But in 1965, when I was a young professional and also teaching at the University of Southern California, I got a phone call inviting me to be in something called the Columbia Symphony Orchestra, which was going to record two masterpieces of Stravinsky with the composer conducting. The pieces were Pulchionella in its complete form, including a singer, George Shirley, who was from New England Conservatory, and the Baiser de la Fée, or the Fairies Kiss, which was his ballet based upon the music of Tchaikovsky. So there I was, sitting in the orchestra while he's conducting, and he looked very much, what was like his elbow was hanging from a puppet string, and he conducted very much that way. And can you imagine now, I've been in the same city with this great man, and now I am playing an orchestra, and he's right there conducting. Okay. So it happened that the second piece, the Fairies Kiss, was recorded rather quickly. The orchestra was very good. I'm not talking about myself, I was okay, but there were great wind players and prominent Hollywood musicians sitting in the principal chairs. And there was an hour left in the second recording session, and Columbia Records had to pay the musicians for that hour, and they didn't want to waste it. And so they had known this in advance. One of Stravinsky's great friends in his Los Angeles Hollywood days was the British writer Aldous Huxley. And Huxley had died, and Stravinsky wrote a piece in memory of him. By that time, he was a 12-tone composer, influenced very much by Robert Kraft, the young fellow from New York, who was telling him that he should try and write in that style. And we were sight reading this piece. Nobody had ever seen it before. I think it had been played once. And Columbia was trying to get a recording of it. And it was very pointillistic. I mean, it was the kind of a theme. I can't even remember what the theme was, but each variation was a different section of the orchestra with tiny little mini notes and swimming around. And this I remember, and I can tell you, even as I report it to you right now, I get chills in my spine. When during the Rin variation he was dissatisfied, he stopped, and this is what he said to them. I'll kind of imitate his voice. "No, you play it too loud. Softer you play it, more beautiful it is. I think it is beautiful. I like my music." Wow. And I still, right now, I get chills thinking about, I was sitting in the room with this great, great composer, and who was always seen as kind of a distant figure and witty, charming, brilliant, daring. But there he was, really just saying how much he loved what he was doing. And I've never forgotten that. Anyway, tonight's program is going to focus on a period of his life in which he had already become very famous and was living in the glow of that and the search for what came after. That period of time is, roughly speaking, 1913 to 1925. In that period, he was mostly living in Paris, but also in Switzerland. And I would say, if I want to think overall about Stravinsky as an artist, and I've thought about this a lot because he's very important to me in terms of what he stood for and what he wrote. He was somebody who was always looking to the past and looking around him to what else was going on in the world of music, but also creating a future, taking music in a direction that was his. So, as we'll see, that in the pieces we're playing tonight, he was reacting to what came before, and by the time he reacted to it in some fashion, it was no longer what came before, but it was Stravinsky. So we're going to look at those pieces tonight from this period to get a real sense of him at that time. So by 1911, Stravinsky was active in Paris because of the influence of a great impresario named Diaghilev, Sergei Diaghilev. Diaghilev was passionate about new music and passionate about ballet. He, fellow countryman of Stravinsky, had built something in Paris called the Ballet Russe, the Russian ballet. And of course, he commissioned him to write a piece that was what we consider standard now, the Firebird, based upon Russian folklore and with a very colorful score, very much influenced by Stravinsky's teacher, Rimsky-Korsakov. And he followed that a year later by another one based upon Russian folk traditions called Petrushka, Little Pete. And that also was a ballet with huge success in Paris. So the next thing he came along with was probably what people think about when they're thinking about Stravinsky. It was this amazing, groundbreaking, frightening, glorifying piece called the Rite of Spring. And it was based upon Russian folk elements celebrating the coming of spring, which was a big deal in Russia. My teacher, Gregor Pierorsky, who came of age in Moscow, remembered that when spring came, the ice on the rivers cracked with huge thunderous sound. So the arrival of spring was a really big deal for a country that was dark in the winter. And he wrote this piece that was groundbreaking. There's so much said about it, I don't think you need more from me. But I'd like to get now a little bit more into the individual pieces of our program, which build, to some degree, on that Russian folk tradition. The first piece we're going to look at is 3 pieces for string quartet, which he wrote in 1913. Now, when we, in First Monday, think about string quartets, we think about Beethoven, we think about Mozart, we think about Mendelssohn, we think about Haydn, who really created the form, we think about Schumann, we think about Tchaikovsky, we think about lots and lots of great composers, most of them in some part of the 19th century. Stravinsky didn't want to go that way. He wanted to go a new way, and he wanted to protest in a way against all of these long, beautiful melodies. And so he wrote a string quartet, which is, for most people upon its first hearing, confusing. And so that's why I want to tell you something about it, because we're going to hear it in this concert. Stravinsky was always pushing the envelope. He didn't want the string quartet to have any resemblance to that heritage that I've spoken of. So here we are, 3 movements. The first movement, which has little rhythmic cells that repeat and change slightly, could well have been the first example of minimalism, which became very, very famous, more to our time. And all the movements are short, but he was really exploring what do you do when you have a little rhythmic thing and you change it slightly as you go along. And that's, of course, what minimalism is about. The second movement, Eccentric, is a direct homage to an English music hall performer known as Little Titch. He was a very short man who wore shoes that were about that long. And he would prance around the stage and make all kinds of really weird motions. And he was hugely popular in England. And it happened that Stravinsky was in England and saw a performance by him. So this second movement, which is da-da, 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 is in homage to that actor. And doesn't sound like any other string quartet you've heard, I don't think. And finally, he came to a movement to close it, which goes into the folk traditions and the religious traditions of old Russia. And it is slow, deep, and later on, he even said the last 20 bars of it were some of the best music of our time, about himself. And that is that piece. Now, I'm going to connect and look forward that we're ending our season, the beginning of next May, with a piece that began to be written the same year that he wrote the string quartet, and that is known as Lesnos, the Wedding. And this is a huge piece, and of course I'm going to talk a lot to you about it when we get nearer that time in preparation for the May concert. But Lesnos is all about the traditions of the old Russia, the things that lead up to a wedding ceremony and that. And so this is always part of him. He's looking at what happens with his people or with other people. We're now going to present next the Octet of Stravinsky for winds, written in 1923. As we said about the string quartet, he was always looking backwards and looking forward. And he came to using wind instruments more and more in his life because he thought that they could play his musical ideas more objectively. He was, in a way, resisting the idea of the string virtuoso who brings great personality to the composer they're representing. And Stravinsky wanted it to be what he wanted it to be. So he wrote an octet for winds, and he based it upon some classical forms because by that time, 1923, he was known as a neoclassical composer. So there are references to, they're in this piece in movements. There's a theme and variations, there's a waltz within it. There are various looking backwards on sort of things. And yet at the same time, nobody could mistake this piece for being by anybody other than Igor Stravinsky. It's his own way of dealing with rhythm and sonorities and how things are put together that distinguishes the greatness of his writing. I want to say just that this piece is so important in the coming of age of wind players that it is almost impossible to imagine any wind player coming to a school like NEC or any conservatory anywhere in the world, anywhere school, who doesn't study and perform and play the octet. It's just so universally part of the core repertory of those instruments. And there's no exception about that with NEC. And we have a terrific group of players, some of whom are alums, some are graduate students, who are playing in this performance. And it's a moment for me just to say a big thank you to somebody on our faculty who's been here longer than me, John Heiss. And I would bet that every one of those people at some point, or most of them, has had the great privilege of studying this piece coached by John Heiss. This is just such a central piece for the wind players, and I want really to thank him for all he gives to NEC. We're going to go back a few years now to talk about two pieces that follow, and I want to lump them together in my comments. In 1920, or thereabouts, he was approached by Diaghilev again, said, you know, I need a piece from you that really is going to be popular. You know, anybody giving concerts worries about selling tickets. And Diaghilev was a master at that. He was always doing things that would attract an audience. And remember, it's ballet that he's writing. So Diaghilev said, you know, something Italian, something like of that old tradition. And so Stravinsky got the idea of looking at something that's known as Commedia dell'arte, which rose in the 15th, 16th century in Italy, in various places, mostly northern Italy, but not exclusively. It was also down in Naples, in which you would have stock characters of different types, like a pretty girl, an eager, handsome young man, an old doctor who was interested in younger women, a clown type. All of these people were part of the standard characters in those productions. And it was a little bit like a modern day series on television, a comedy series. You know, you'd have the same people coming back week after week with some new storyline. But you got to know them as people. You got to know them, what role they were playing in the relationships with some new version of it. So he got the idea and the inspiration to take music of that time, and somebody gave him, or he found a book of music by the Italian composer Giovanni Pergolesi, who lived a very short life from 1710 to 1726 and died of tuberculosis, to influence him to take that music and make something out of it for a ballet. That ballet became Pulchionella. Pulchionella is kind of an Italian way of saying, like the English tradition of Punch and Judy. It was comedians who were dealing with life situations. Pulchionella is a full ballet. And actually, as I mentioned earlier, I am in the recording of it that he did in 1965. I'm somewhere back there in the orchestra. I don't think you can hear me particularly, but I certainly was there. Anyway, much later on, I discovered that among those pieces in that volume of Pergolesi, we learned later that a lot of those pieces were of that time but not written by Pergolesi. But one of them really was. It was a sonata for cello, I'm a cellist, and continuo, harpsichord. And he took the last movement of that in a very Stravinskyan way, and at a certain point in the big ballet, he wrote a duet of that for not cello and harpsichord, but double bass and trombone. There you are again, he's just, this is no longer Pergolesi, even though the notes are originally by him. It's Stravinsky. And I thought that excerpt, which is very short, was so representative of how he would take anything and make it into him, make it into his. And so that's one of the two pieces that we're going to hear next. The other is another version of paying attention to music around him. I think we know in this country the name Scott Joplin. Certainly at New England Conservatory we do, because my predecessor as president, Gunther Schuller, was very interested in Scott Joplin. Scott Joplin was an African-American man, I think from St. Louis, who wrote a lot of pieces that were known as ragtime. Somebody gave him music by Scott Joplin. He didn't know anything about ragtime. He read the music, and 2 or 3 times in his life, in this period, he wrote something that he called ragtime. And we're going to hear the one tonight from 1920, which is, the same time as Pulchionella, which is for a small ensemble. And as I said before about him, this is not ragtime, it's Stravinsky. But it has wonderfully infectious rhythm. And I'll say, last of all, about, as the director of a series like this, which has great music played by great performers, none of whom are paid, that it gives me a real excuse to be adventurous in the programming, because I can use as many people as I need and not have to worry about breaking the bank and finding fees. I feel always mixed about that, because I think musicians, like anybody else, should be paid for what they're doing. But our musicians are people who want to play on this series, who love playing in Jordan Hall, who love playing with one another. So we're having a performance of the ragtime and of the Pulchionella, using all of the forces that we need, and only those, to put together this program up to this point. So I think these are really lively pieces, and you're going to enjoy them a lot. The last piece on our program tonight is a version made by the composer of his great, great triumph, the Rite of Spring. And it's very interesting that I don't have to tell you much about the Rite of Spring. It's so much written about, it's so much talked about, so much disputed, discussed. Did the music come from Russian folk music? Stravinsky said no. Many other people say, of course it did. But it was certainly based upon Russian folk heritage. It's interesting that after that piece was written, he decided to make a transcription of this huge orchestration, like something by Rimsky-Korsakov or like his earlier ballets, for two pianists. He wrote it originally for piano four hands, like Mozart wrote for four hands and Schubert wrote for four hands. Tonight's performance is actually not deviating from that, except that two pianos are going to be used so that the two players are separated and working together. I don't think there's much more I have to tell you about it. We're up for a great performance of that, and I know you're going to enjoy it.